Good evening. My name is Chris Teutsch. I'm the Forage Extension Specialist located at the University of Kentucky's Research and Education Center in Princeton, Kentucky. And tonight I'm going to be visiting with you about optimizing existing forage resources. And the subtitle that I gave my talk was Using What the Good Lord Gave Us. Early on in my career, I was stationed at a research station much like Princeton, but located in the southern Piedmont of Virginia. And when I first got there, I was fresh out of graduate school. I had the good fortune of working with Mike Henry. And Mike Henry was a senior extension agent in Amelia County. And one of the things that Mike told me was that you can plant whatever you want in a field. In 4 to 5 years, it's going to be a mixture of tall fescue and white clover and Bermuda grass, a little bit of Kentucky bluegrass, maybe some orchard grass, and crabgrass kind of filling in the spaces where there's nothing growing. And probably truer words have never been spoken. We often think about pastures as being monocultures, but they're not really monocultures. If you go out and look at a mature pasture, so a pasture that's 4 or 5 years old, it's going to be a mixture of a whole bunch of different things. And how we manage that mixture can impact what species are dominant within that mixture. And that's kind of what I want to focus in on tonight. How do we optimize both the productivity of that mixture, but also optimize the species in that mixture to meet our needs? If we want more summer grasses, how can we get more summer grasses through managing that mixture versus reseeding something else? So tonight I want to talk about some key concepts, and the first one is soil fertility, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about both the pH of the soil and also a little bit about soil fertility. I also want to talk about forage plant growth in relation to grazing management. I think it's absolutely imperative that people understand a little bit about how forage plants grow, and if they have that basic understanding, then grazing management starts to make sense to them. We're going to talk about grazing timing and nitrogen fertilization timing in terms of manipulating botanical composition within pastures. And we'll kind of put things together with a couple of real-world examples. And the last thing I just want to mention is using improved varieties in forage systems. A lot of times when we talk about soil fertility, we like to talk about indicator plants. And those are plants that tell us something's not quite right with that particular field or pasture. Could be too acid or too alkaline. It could have low fertility and so on. The problem with indicator plants is they don't tell you exactly what's wrong. And to really do that, we need to get a soil test. And a soil sample should always be the basis of a soil fertility program. And getting a good sample is absolutely imperative because accurate results are going to be dependent on getting a representative sample from that pasture. So just a couple guidelines for getting that representative sample. We want that sample to represent less than 20 acres. We want it to be 15 to 20 cores. We always want to use a soil probe. Using a shovel is not as accurate as a soil probe, so we want you to use a soil probe and we want you to sample to a depth of 4 inches for pastures. We want to avoid areas where animals congregate at. And those could be areas around hay feeders, could be around a water, could be shade areas, or around a pond. Anywhere where animals are going to congregate, they're going to concentrate nutrients, and that's going to elevate our soil test results and the results will not be representative of the pasture area. And then we want to make sure that we do all the paperwork and submit the sample through our extension agent. The nice thing about using University of Kentucky Regulatory Services to test your soil samples is that your extension agent will get a copy of the results, and they can help you interpret those results and make recommendations in terms of fertilizer and lime for your particular situation. I want to start out with soil acidity and liming, and this is a major problem that limits forage production in the southeastern United States, including states in the transition zone like Kentucky and Tennessee and Virginia. And low soil pH reduces nutrient availability and also reduces nitrogen fixation. This is just a nice diagram that shows the impact of soil pH on nutrient availability. The wider each one of those bands are, the more available that nutrient is. So if you take an example, for example, the pH range which we would consider ideal would be 6 to 7 for most pastures. That's when we have maximum availability of most of our primary nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium. That's when that band is the widest. As we start to slip down in towards 5, a lot of these nutrients become much less available in the soil. The reason I'm showing you this is that if you take a soil test and your soil test indicates that you need lime, lime is going to be your best buy in terms of amendments for the soil because it's going to make all the other nutrients in the soil more plant available. And that's very important to understand. So lime neutralizes soil acidity and it also supplies calcium and in some cases magnesium if you're using a dolomitic lime. General guidelines are here for grasses and grass mixtures. Generally speaking, for most pasture situations where we're going to have a grass-clover mixture, we want our pH to be between 6 and 6.4. If we're going to try to use alfalfa, then we want it to be closer to 6.8 when we start. Not all forage species have the same tolerance for soil acidity. So, for example, orchard grass has fair tolerance, while something like Bermuda grass would have excellent tolerance. And Sericea lespedeza would have excellent tolerance. So in situations where soil pH is low, often we'll have species that are more tolerant to those low soil pH dominating in those swards. So we can change that species makeup by applying agricultural limestone, which makes other species within that sward more competitive. The last thing I want to just mention about soil fertility is Liebig's law of the minimum. And essentially what Liebig's law of the minimum says is that whatever essential plant growth factor, and there's lots of different essential plant growth factors, could include temperature, moisture, and also nutrients. Whatever's the most limiting is going to limit overall pasture production. And that's important to understand. And we can kind of think about that as a barrel, and each stave in that barrel represents a different essential plant growth factor. In this particular example, potassium is the lowest stave. So regardless of how much water we put in there, we'll never fill that barrel up until we take care of that stave that's potassium. That means we need to add potassium to this system. The point that I want you to take home from this diagram is that we can't pick and choose what nutrient we want to supply in that pasture. We've got to figure out what's the most limiting, and that's what a soil test is going to help us do, and then supply that nutrient so that we have a complete complete and balanced nutrient program. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about grazing management. And rotational stocking is a practice that is often recommended, and the question is does it really pay? And this was a summary of the literature that was done in 2012, and it looked at the proportional advantage of rotational stocking. So what's the benefits? How much more productivity do we get when we use rotational stocking versus continuous stocking? And these were scientific studies that were done and summarized in this paper. And what they found was that on average you get about a 30% increase in pasture productivity when we switch from a continuous to rotational stocking system. There's not many things that we can do in agriculture that we're going to get a 30% boost in productivity just by changing our management practice. So rotational stocking definitely pays for itself. One of the issues with implementing rotational stocking is that sometimes I think we make it too hard. This was a quote from an article that I wrote for the Cow Country News in 2017. And I guess it shows you how much of a slow learner I am. After almost 2 decades of attending and teaching grazing schools, it finally dawned on me, we make implementing rotational stocking too hard. And I think there's a lot of truth in that statement. We start talking about installing miles of pipelines and fences and four-ball waters and so on and so forth, and using temporary fencing. And, and people see that and they're like, whoa, that's a little more than I want to do. In reality, on most farms, all we need to do to implement a rudimentary rotational stocking system is close a gate. And if we can close a gate and separate our farm into 3 or 4 paddocks, then we're kind of getting started with rotational stocking. And over time, we can improve that grazing system as we start to see the benefits of it. A rotational grazing system is not something we just put in place and it's there. It's a development. We're developing our grazing management skills, we're refining our infrastructure, and it's constantly changing and adapting to conditions. Whenever I talk about forage plant growth and grazing management, I always like to start with photosynthesis. It's the most important biochemical process on Earth. It converts light energy from the sun to chemical energy, and it does that through the plant. This is the chemical formula. We take carbon dioxide from the air, water from the soil, and convert it into sugars and carbohydrates. And an important byproduct for us, of course, is oxygen. And this all happens in the chloroplast of the plant cell. So that's a specialized part of the plant cell that has the machinery to carry out photosynthesis. And this whole process is driven with light energy from the sun. I like to think of the farm as a big solar panel. And really what we want to do is we want to maximize the size of that solar panel. The bigger the solar panel, the more productive our pastures are going to be. We have the ability to harvest more sunlight and convert it from that light energy into chemical energy in the short form of sugars and carbohydrates. So by utilizing rotational stocking, we're able to manage that solar panel and maximize that solar panel on our farm. We have a defoliation event taking place here. If we have adequate water and adequate nutrients in our soils, what do we need for regrowth? The answer is energy. And that energy comes from 2 places. So for that pasture regrow, you've got to have energy, and that energy is going to come from 2 places in a grass plant. It's going to come from leaf area remaining after grazing, so that's that solar panel. We're managing that when we have a rotational stocking system. We're managing how close they graze that pasture. The closer they graze it, the smaller that solar panel is. If we leave 4 to 5 inches of residual, then that solar panel is going to be larger and that pasture is going to regrow faster. It also comes from carbohydrates that are stored up within the plant. And they're stored at different locations in different plants. And where they're stored makes not a lot of difference, and I'll tell you what difference it is in a minute, but the fact that we have those stored carbohydrates, that's going to help fuel regrowth. So we always want to make sure that our plants have adequate stored carbohydrates in the grazing system. So different plants store carbohydrates in different places. Now, as I said earlier, it's not really that important where they store them at, but it does impact how we manage that plant under grazing. So for example, orchard grass, or tall fescue for that matter, stores its carbohydrates in the stem base. What's that mean in terms of grazing management? That means that if we graze an orchard grass or tall fescue pasture very closely, we're not only removing all the leaf area, so that solar panel, but we're also removing stored carbohydrates that are located in the stem base. Something like Bermuda grass stores its carbohydrates in the stolons and rhizomes. That's underground stems that grow either along the top of the soil or right underneath the soil surface. What's important about that is that those stems, or those modified stems that are called stolons and rhizomes, are safely below the grazing height of the animal. And that means that we can graze a Bermuda grass pasture very closely and not hurt its stored carbohydrates. I always like to talk about carbohydrate cycling in forage plants, and I like to use alfalfa as an example because it's 100% dependent upon stored carbohydrates for regrowth. After we cut an alfalfa field, if you look in this bottom picture, there's nothing left but stems, but yet it regrows very vigorously. And the reason it regrows so vigorously is it utilizes stored carbohydrates in the taproot of the plant to regrow with. This line on the bottom represents the concentration of stored carbohydrates in the taproot of the plant. So as this plant starts to regrow after a defoliation event, so it's regrowing here, as it starts to regrow, the concentration of stored carbohydrates in the taproot decreases very rapidly. And at some point, it starts to creep back up. What's happening at this point? Well, the plant has reached a size of about 6 to 8 inches tall. It's got enough leaf area that it's fixing enough sugars and carbohydrates through photosynthesis to meet the growth need of that plant, plus have a little bit of extra left over. And that extra gets stored back up in the taproot of the plant. And by the time we get 28 to 30 days out, we're back up to pre-cut levels. This is very, very important to realize. All forage plants have a carbohydrate cycle like this. It's most pronounced in alfalfa, but even grasses will cycle carbohydrates. And what we want to do is make sure that our carbohydrates are at the highest possible level at all times, because that allows the plants to draw those carbohydrates down after a defoliation event, after it's gone through winter, or after it's gone through some kind of stress like a drought. And it can use those stored carbohydrates for regrowth after those events. This is a nice diagram that kind of summarizes the morphology and physiology in relation to grazing management. Morphology is just a fancy word for the physical structure of the plant, and physiology is a fancy word for those things that are going on inside the plant, like photosynthesis and carbohydrate cycling within the plant. So on this diagram, we have several different grass plants. We've got, for example, an orchard grass here. We look at a pretty close grazing height, so this is below 2 inches. What do we have left underneath that dotted line? Not a lot on the orchard grass plant. We've got some stems left, and we have removed most of the leaf area. Plus, we're getting down into that stem base. Remember, orchard grass stored its carbohydrates in that stem base. So what we're doing when we graze orchard grass really closely or mow it closely in a hayfield with a disc mower, we're removing all of its solar panel, plus we're getting down into its stored carbohydrates. So we're kind of putting a double whammy on that orchard grass plant. Really, I would like you to be at 4 to 5 inches with orchard grass in a defoliation height, and that would leave a lot more solar panel after the grazing event has taken place. Now, if we look at something like Bermuda grass, even at that close height, Bermuda grass is storing its stored carbohydrates in the rhizomes, this underground stem, and then the stolons, this one right along the sole surface. Both safely below the grazing height of the animal. Plus, there's quite a bit of green leaf area underneath this grazing height. The point that I want to make is that Bermuda grass is going to be a lot more tolerant to close and frequent grazing versus something like orchard grass or even tall fescue. So if I had a mixed pasture of orchard grass and fescue and Bermuda grass, and I want to shift that stand towards the Bermuda grass, one thing I could do in terms of grazing management is graze that pasture hard, especially in late spring or early summer, and that will hurt the taller growing grasses, fescue and orchard grass, and shift that composition towards the Bermuda grass. Now, if I want to shift the composition away from Bermuda grass towards tall fescue or orchard grass, then I leave a higher grazing height, and that will help to shade the Bermuda grass, and I don't graze it hard during the summer months. I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about manipulating botanical composition with nitrogen fertilization. I think this is something that's often not well recognized by producers, but we can shift botanical composition by when we time our nitrogen applications to pastures and hayfields. So, for example, here, if I want to take this mixed stand of tall fescue and Bermuda grass and shift it towards the Bermuda grass, then I would want to fertilize in late spring or early summer. Why is that? Well, if we look at the growth curves, tall fescue, a cool season grass, as we get into late May and early June, its productivity is really decreasing because its growth is being limited by high temperatures during the summer months. That's the same time that Bermuda grass growth is really just taking off, and we're going to get optimum Bermuda grass growth around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So by timing our nitrogen fertilization to late spring, early summer, we're stimulating the Bermuda grass growth in this mixed stand, and that will shift that botanical composition towards the Bermuda grass. If we combine that with grazing management, so close grazing and hard grazing in late spring and early summer, that's going to shift that composition towards that Bermuda grass. Okay, same growth curve. Say we want to favor the fescue in this stand. How do we do that? Well, we can do it again with fertilization, but we want to fertilize earlier in the growing season so that we're hitting the Bermuda grass and the tall fescue and stimulating its growth early in the growing season. And then we don't want to graze that pasture too close, especially as we go into the summer months. We can put a second shot of nitrogen on in late summer, early fall, and again, that's going to be stimulating that tall fescue growth here in the late summer or early fall, the second hump of growth. We call the forage distribution on tall fescue ladino clover mixture a bimodal distribution, so it has two humps compared with one hump of Bermuda grass. So what we're doing is we're avoiding putting nitrogen on the Bermuda grass when it's going to be most productive. So let's take a look at a second example, and that's a tall fescue white clover mix. And this is a pretty common mix that we find in pastures. And a lot of times we'll become dominated by white clover. So if we want to shift the botanical composition away from the clover towards the grass, this is some things that we can do. We can raise the grazing height to leave more residual leaf area for the grass. Remember that grass really relies on a combination of leaf area after grazing, so that solar panel, and then stored carbohydrates. When we graze close, we reduce that solar panel and we get down into the stem base of that tall growing grass and reduce the amount of carbohydrates that plant has access to use for regrowth. So by raising that grazing height, we're going to tend to favor the taller growing grass in that mixture. And then we can actually put a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer on that grass legume mix to stimulate that grass growth. Same mixture, but we want to shift the composition towards the white clover. Usually this is not a problem because most people will graze close enough and frequently enough that we will tend to shift the composition towards white clover rather than the tall growing grass. But I did have a good friend in Virginia who was a meticulous grass manager. And he would have problems getting and keeping clover in his stands because he never grazed his pastures really close. So if we do want to shift that composition towards the clover, then what we can do is we can graze closer, and that puts tall fescue or orchard grass at a disadvantage because we're removing that solar panel, that residual leaf area, and we're getting down into the stem base of that plant where it stores its carbohydrates at. And by grazing closer, we're also allowing more light to reach that white clover, and that's going to tend to allow that white clover to be more dominant in that mixture. And then not apply any nitrogen fertilizer, and that will tend to favor the clover in that mixture. Okay, the last example I want to give is with crabgrass. And we commonly think of crabgrass as a weed, but it can supply a pretty good summer forage if we manage it during the summer months. So in this example, we want to shift the botanical composition towards the crabgrass to supply more summer grazing within our system. So how do we do that? Well, one thing that we can do is we can broadcast a little bit of improved crabgrass seed. Yes, you can buy improved crabgrass variety. There's about a half a dozen crabgrass varieties on the market now, and we are currently testing those in Kentucky. So we can, if you're interested in seeing the results, you can go to the UKY Forage's webpage and look at variety trial results. So we can broadcast this seed on in late winter and then drag it in, just like we would frost seed clover. So we graze the pasture close, broadcast the seed on, drag it if we can, and then we start to graze the tall fescue, and we graze it close in late spring and summer especially. And what that does is it puts that tall fescue at a disadvantage. It opens that sod up and it allows that crabgrass to germinate. Crabgrass needs a space to grow. So we want to create a sod that's a little bit more open by grazing it hard so that that crabgrass can have a place to grow within that sward. We can apply some nitrogen in late spring or early summer. Crabgrass responds well to nitrogen fertilization, and that will also stimulate that crabgrass growth and increase the crabgrass component in that sward. And then during the summer months, we manage the crabgrass, not the fescue. That means that we graze the crabgrass down to about 3 to 4 inches, allow it to regrow, graze it again. The last thing that I want to talk about is using improved forage varieties, and Jesse Raymer did a great job talking about that yesterday. Jesse's take was from a very intensively managed dairy grazing system. And in that type of a system, improved forage varieties make sense to use when you're reseeding pastures. And they make sense to use even in this system too when we're overseeding pastures. In the intensive management system that Jesse described, he was reseeding pastures every 3 to 5 years. And in that situation, we definitely need to be using improved varieties. Improved varieties offer a lot of things to us. They have improved yield and digestibility, increased persistence. We have a non-toxic tall fescue, maybe herbicide tolerance depending on the species that we're using and so forth. So there's a lot of advantages to using improved varieties. We have one of the most extensive variety testing programs in the country here at the University of Kentucky, and I would encourage you to use that. You can reach that by going to our web page here, and if you just search UKY Forages, it's going to be the first thing that comes up, and then click on the variety testing icon here. And if you do that, it'll take you to the variety testing program. And there's lots of data there, and sometimes it's overwhelming, but the one single publication that you need to look at for selecting varieties is long-term summary of Kentucky forage variety trials. And what it does is it gives you a long-term summary of how different varieties have performed in Kentucky. I just want to end with a final thought. And the final thought that I have for you tonight is that forage and grazing management is really a powerful tool, and we can use it to not only increase productivity of pastures, but also shift the botanical composition towards species that we desire. Maybe it's more Bermuda grass or crabgrass during the summer months in some of our pastures. Maybe it's tall fescue for stockpiling for winter grazing. But we can manage that botanical composition through grazing and fertility management. And I kind of want to end there. And the last thing I want to say is that we have got a tremendous resource in our county extension offices. So if you have a question, I always encourage people to go through their local extension office. There's a lot of local knowledge there. They know your farm, they know you, they know the county, they know the soils in your area. It's just a great resource. And if they can't answer your question, they can always get to the specialist that can help answer the questions. All right, with that, I'm done, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have or encourage your comments.